The smoke has cleared over Culloden Moor, and the Jacobite army has suffered a devastating defeat. For many, this is where the popular story ends. But the Jacobite cause doesn't just evaporate into thin air. What happens to the shattered remains of the Highland army? And what becomes of Prince Charles Edward Stuart as the government forces start to close in around him? Welcome back to Prime and Load. I'm Lee Gugino, and I'm joined as always by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. And today, we're going to bring you the finale to our 6-part Jacobite Rising series. To help us close this out, we welcome back our resident expert who's been with us through this entire process, Dr. Aaron Johnston. Together, we'll examine the immediate fallout of the battle, the final fate of the Jacobite forces and its leaders, and the prince's desperate journey back to continental Europe. Thank you for joining us for The Fall of the 45. So, Aaron, we are back with another Jacobite episode. And now I know some of our listeners might be thinking, we've done Culloden. What more is there to say about Jacobites? But obviously, we still have a good amount of stuff to cover, aftermath and what happens to the army and what becomes of the prince. Before we get into all that, can we talk very briefly, kind of a recap of what we talked about last episode? There was the Battle of Culloden and kind of the immediate fallout after that battle. Can we review that real quick?
Yeah, so we'd gone through what appeared on the surface to be almost a period of Jacobite recovery once again, only to come crashing down with the from the Jacobite perspective, disastrous engagement at Culloden, following on from the failed night march on the 15th of April 1746. The Jacobite army faced its final field confrontation against the Duke of Cumberland, and in the space of about an hour was very heavily defeated. I won't say destroyed, because the army is not destroyed, but it suffers its first and what proves to be a pretty decisive setback on the battlefield. Charles Edward Stuart himself, after being unable to rally the remnants of the army, is forced off the battlefield by those around him. Comes within a whisper of being cut off and captured himself. It's really only when the danger is acute to his person that he's dragged off the field. Whilst the battle line is what remains of it is disintegrating behind. So after a very protracted campaign that's gone up and down the length of the country, what we now find going into the second half of April 1746 is that the Jacobite forces are now dispersed for the first time since the conflict began back in the middle of August. And the Duke of Cumberland has at last achieved what he has been trying to achieve personally since the beginning of the new year, what his predecessors had been attempting to secure since August, which is a single decisive engagement on the battlefield that ends the military threat of the Jacobites. So that's where we are. We're in a position where the Jacobites have left 1,500 dead, perhaps, behind them on the battlefield, and considerably more being rounded up in the hours that follow the battle. But also, it should be said, with regiments of the Jacobite army marching off the field with colours intact as formed bodies and withdrawing from the field. But because of the nature of how they are able to extricate themselves from the defeat, and because of the to a significant degree, I think it's fair to say, significant advantage of cavalry that the Duke of Cumberland possesses, it's extremely difficult for the Jacobite army units that do survive the battle to maintain any form of communication, contact, or the capacity to plan. So we're now at essentially the end point for the Jacobites as a field force capable of actually achieving anything.
And so you talked about how Jacobites are for the first time dispersed on the battlefield. On the other side, how did the government forces exploit the victory that they just gained?
Well, the immediate objective is to secure Inverness, and so that is done, and not particularly tidily either, because lead elements of the British Army are moving into Inverness, pretty much cutting down anything that's encountered along the way, and with relatively light regard, it might be fair to say, for any real evidence as to whether they had been engaged in the fighting or not. So the news of the Jacobite defeat flows into Inverness in the most horrific way you might expect. But from a military perspective, the securing of Inverness is obviously significant. It's the reason why the Jacobites had felt obliged to fight a battle. After all, was to maintain access to Inverness, its access to the sea, and its role as the only significant depot town potentially for in the Highlands. And so that's one priority. The second is, of course, to immediately exploit the victory by getting out there and to secure, and not only the prince, but also any Jacobite leaders that can be caught, and to make sure that the Jacobites that escape from the field are dispersed, and not able to rally together in units. So those are the priorities. That there's all sorts of practical things, of course, that slow those processes down, not least the fact that there are quite a number of prisoners to be taken. And there are pockets of resistance around the battlefield. Famously, there's a Jacobite gun over in Culloden Park walls on the far left of the Jacobite line that does a little bit of extra service at the end, towards the end of the battle, in trying to slow down the capacity of the British dragoons to go riding off immediately in pursuit of the Jacobite left. And there are units like the surviving pickets that have been sent over from France that have to be dealt with in the immediate aftermath of the defeat of the Highland and Lowland regiments. So there's a lot going on in those first hours, but the real priority is to make sure that this is decisive, that the Jacobite force cannot recover from its setback. What we don't want from Cumberland's perspective is a repeat of what the Jacobites had experienced, which is that they'd beaten Henry Hawley's army on the battlefield, but had not pursued it, and the core of that army had survived to come on and fight again. That is not on the table here. This is putting an end to a bad business from the British government's perspective.
And you said one of the government's objectives was to secure as many of those Jacobite leaders as possible. How do they escape, or do they escape? Especially, we've got Charles Edward, who's got to get out of Dodge pretty quickly, doesn't he?
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative, it's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
Yeah, and actually, the government doesn't actually do that well at securing senior Jacobites. There are a few that are taken. For example, the Earl of Kilmarnock, who is captured on the battlefield more or less because he rides straight into the British lines, mistaking some dragoons for red-coated soldiers of Fitzjames Horse, and so he is taken. Famously, his son is fighting in the British lines, and he passes by him as he's taken into captivity and on to subsequent execution in London. And there are a few more, but actually most of the senior leadership of the Jacobite army does get away. Now, one of the advantages the Jacobites have from this perspective, it's a fairly narrow perspective to look for advantages for the Jacobites at this point, but is that they have brought the war right back to their own doorstep. And so the Jacobite leadership is now withdrawing into the Highland fastnesses that they know extremely well, into receptive territory, receptive communities, and landscapes that are extremely difficult to police and patrol. And so they have that initial advantage in terms of being able to sort of soak themselves back into the hillsides. The problem that they then find is the logistical difficulties of getting out of Scotland. So some of them don't achieve it at all. Some of them are out living in the hills for years in a few cases, being succoured by their people, as it were, for the chieftains. But others are really hoping to seek passage into Europe, to get out of the reach of the government. There are ongoing discussions in government and military circles, but there's a pretty clear perception that there will be that all of these men will be treated as rebels rather than as prisoners of war. They'll be dealt with by the civil courts, and so the outcome is only likely to be in one direction if you're taken. So those the big problem, therefore, is for the Jacobite commanders is how to both communicate effectively in order to potentially be able to make arrangements to escape, but also to do so without too many people knowing where everybody is. And so it's taken a long time, and I don't think we're entirely there really, to unpick exactly how those networks were working, because there's clearly are quite a lot of people around who do know where people are, but manage to keep the information quiet. So there's some Jacobites who are wounded, some senior Jacobites who are wounded, some who are in very poor health, men like John Murray of Broughton, who's sick and misses out on the Battle of Culloden because he's so unwell, but yet remarkably manages to escape and isn't actually captured until he's down in the borders, close to his own home, near the English border. So that's quite some distance for a sick man to get, whilst there's an entire army deployed to try and catch him. The government particularly disliked Murray of Broughton and were keen to get their hands on him. And likewise, Marquis of Tullibardine, the Jacobite Duke of Athol, who's in very poor health, and is eventually taken, but dies dies in captivity before he's got to London. So the government's haul actually isn't very high, but they are very effective at shutting down opportunities to escape. And so certainly from Charles Edward's point of view, Charles Edward, right since the beginning of the war, has had a price tag of £30,000 on his head. Now that's you run it through an inflation calculator, it's roughly about £8 million. That's a pretty big sum for a Highland crofter. But that's been in place since the outset of the war. But never has he been more vulnerable. And so there's essentially a split in the Jacobite army in the immediate aftermath of Culloden. You've got those who are in a very small clique, like John Sullivan, that are around the Prince still. And then you've got those like Lord George Murray, who are with the remnants of the intact Jacobite, or more or less intact Jacobite regiments, who extricate themselves from the battlefield and separate off in a different direction. They head down to the barracks at Ruthven, which had been captured by the Jacobites earlier in the year. And they, for example, Ogilvy's regiment, Lowland Regiment from the northeast of Scotland, that more or less disbands by itself at just before the end of April. So there are formed bodies of Jacobites, for days and almost weeks after the battle. And obviously they go, men like Lord George Murray are basically going onto their own private resources and contacts to try and get out in a very different path to how Charles Edward and John Sullivan are trying. So the government now has the problem that they're everywhere. They're spreading off in all sorts of different directions, not just in one obvious route. It's very difficult to second guess where the Jacobite leadership will be going, because most of the Jacobite leaders themselves didn't know where to go.
Could I jump in with a couple of questions there, Aaron? Is there any sense amongst any of the command? I mean, you mentioned that some of the army gets off in good orders. Is there a general acceptance that Culloden is the final, that's it, it's over? Or is there any thought, well, we've still got some troops, we could maybe, a guerrilla war, we could keep this going in some way?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously it's really difficult for us to know exactly what people genuinely thought at this moment in time, because most of the Jacobite accounts of this are written obviously a little bit later and with hindsight, and everybody is trying to cover their decision-making at this point. There is a perception, I think, from Charles Edward that there is still some life left in the embers. Now, if you put yourself in his shoes, he's been basically forced into bringing the war back into the Highlands against his own judgment, and has had some of these men telling him for months that they can hold out in the Highlands much better than they can do elsewhere. So Charles does manage. He does write a letter, basically telling those that are still in arms that they should hold together as a body, that the senior commissioned officers like Lord George Murray should remain in post and continue to lead them, and essentially saying his role now as the commander, he's got no way of leading them in a meaningful military way in the Highlands. So the best that he can do for them is to get out of Scotland, get to France, and then persuade King Louis to throw some fresh wood onto the fire, and reignite it from there. And the British government, I think, is still concerned about the potential for a French landing, and so that's Charles's intention. He sets that out very clearly. He will go now. It doesn't matter how many ambassadors I send. He more or less says they can say no to my envoys, but they won't say no to me. And so that's his hope, is to get there. And what he tells the Jacobite regiments to do is to stay together and defer to people like Murray, either in order to continue a resistance, or, he says, because you'll be able to negotiate better terms whilst you're still a formed body in the field. And so that's what he says. Now, it's not entirely clear whether or who receives that letter. It's clearly intended for the regiments that gather at Ruthven. There's another letter that comes the other way from Lord George Murray, resigning his commission and laying out how everything was John Sullivan's fault, and that he'd said all the way through that this wasn't the way to fight the war. You've led us up to this path, and thank you very much. I'm done. So there's two very different perspectives there, as there have been throughout this story. But what Charles can't predict is that it's going to take him an awfully long time to get out of Scotland, by which time any possibility of reigniting the cause is gone. There's a very, very small window for a very optimistic perception that you might be able to recover from this position, and it dissipates very quickly. But once people like Lord George have stood down, essentially, then there's nothing left.
Since we're on this topic, obviously the leaders of the Jacobite army are different than the soldiers that they command, but what about the common soldiers? What kind of treatment could they expect? Probably nothing as glamorous, but surely being on the losing side wouldn't have been good for them.
No, it's a disaster because you're as a rebel in arms, you're outside of the expectation of any mercy. Now you've got no protections as a prisoner of war. There's protracted discussions, Andrew. Now I'm sure more about this than I about how to deal with the French prisoners, especially those who were actual Scots and so on. But no, I mean, there are two sides to sort of the aftermath here for those who are taken or caught up by the army. There are those that are rounded up and then processed and recorded, and there are those that aren't. And of course we can't numerate those, but there is a good amount of testimony for the killing of wounded on the field, for appalling conditions that prisoners are held in. The deliberate lack of supplies, offhand executions in and around Inverness in the immediate aftermath and days after the battle. No medical treatment provided for the Jacobites, all of which is born from, I think, the proximity to which the Jacobites had come to really upsetting the government. It's a reflection of the seriousness of the challenge that they had come to represent. But it stands out all the more starkly as a contrast to how the Jacobites had attempted to treat the wounded and the prisoners that they themselves had taken after Falkirk and after Prestonpans, where the prince had even been criticised by his own for giving too much medical attention and care to the British soldiers wounded. But it's a different context, and this isn't obviously excusing or justifying, but it's important. The context of the Jacobites trying to win hearts and minds and to secure and fight the type of campaign that Charles Edward is looking for. It's very different to the perspective of the government that sees itself as the legitimate government that has just asserted itself, that believes it has the support of the majority of the people, even in Scotland, and that is now trying to, in wartime, whilst it is engaged in conflict all over the world, is trying to deal with a problem in the backyard in a way that it will never have to be dealt with again. So there's a lot of factors playing into that response, and I think that one of the driving ones is this desire to get this dealt with quickly, and make sure that this isn't a problem, so that we don't have months and months and months of guerrilla fighting in the Highlands.
Just to digress on the French prisoners, because I mean we spoke about this a little bit on the St Patrick's Day episode last year when I was talking about the Irish Brigade, so I won't go on at any great length, but there was quite a concerted effort to work out which of them were born in the British Isles and had taken themselves to France to fight for a foreign king, and which of them were perhaps French-born of Scots or Irish descent, and a lot of toing and froing as to, well, this man has a strong Irish accent, and so-and-so once saw him in Dublin and the rest of it, and he'd be swearing blind he was born in Lille or something. But and the other problem was some of the French officers who'd been seconded to Jacobite regiments and were taken in civilian clothes had a heck of a job. Nicholas Glasgow of Dillon's, who was posted to Ogilvy's regiment and surrendered with them, has no end of trouble, again because there's some question over whether he's French born or Irish born, but there's quite a lot of paperwork to and fro. They do eventually, with the exception of proven deserters from the British Army, they do eventually repatriate them, so they get a better deal than the Jacobites, but they're certainly the rank and file are locked up in fairly unpleasant conditions until it's been established what their bona fides are and what's to be done with them.
I mean, obviously, over the subsequent weeks and months, the prisoner tally starts rising, and Inverness can't cope with that, and so there's transfers. Some taken down to Edinburgh, but mostly not. Some of the slightly higher status people are being taken to Edinburgh, like, for example, the Duke of Perth's mother, who doesn't seem like a particularly lively military threat, but nevertheless has aggravated the civil authorities. But most are transferred by sea, and there's a lot taken to Carlisle, but also a lot taken down to the Thames, and to Tilbury Fort down there. And then once they're taken, there is then, as I said, they are sort of essentially handed over to civil authorities to be dealt with, and then there is a judicial process that has to move fairly rapidly, and it's there's not an awful lot of labouring over over details of evidence, but there is evidence taken. There are trials, but not for everybody. They eventually moved to a system basically of drawing lots, and processing them that way. And if you don't have to go on trial for your life, then we'll put you in the bag that's going for transportation, for example. And so there's quite a lot of people that therefore come through into the records and emerge, and we see depositions made in their defence or against them. But not all of them we can trace through to an outcome. So we don't. There's a sort of rough consensus around perhaps 120-ish, perhaps a few more who are executed, and quite a large proportion of those are from the Manchester Regiment, who were taken at Carlisle. And then you've got maybe 800 or so who are transported, and then perhaps 200, 250, somewhere in that field, who are exiled, or who end up in exile thereafter.
And so, Aaron, to some extent, you've already kind of made this point, but I just want to kind of reiterate it. And maybe have you done a little bit more. You've told us a story for the last 5-6 episodes. I can't remember exactly how long we've been going now, but of an uprising that at almost every turn had a great chance of success, had the potential to overthrow certainly Hanoverian rule in Scotland, perhaps at certain moments Hanoverian rule everywhere in the British Isles, even as late as the run up to Culloden itself, had a great chance at victory. To play devil's advocate for a moment, if you were the British government, why wouldn't you crack down? I have a very cursory understanding of this period of British history, but as I understand it, there had not been a widespread crackdown or reprisal after either the 1715 or the 1719 uprisings. And so if you're the British government, you're facing the challenge that you've talked about, the war across the world, in Europe and at home. Why would you not try to ensure that this doesn't happen again in a generation or in your lifetime?
Yeah, no, I take that point, and the other thing that's playing is, as you say, there has been a rising in 1715. In 1719, there have been plots in between, and conspiracies in between, and although the 15 was numerically bigger as a deal for the Jacobites, I don't think it penetrated through the minds of the British government quite so sharply as 45 did, because it seemed to lose a lot of its momentum very early. In terms of forward movement, the problem in 1745 was that the Jacobites were, comparative to earlier Jacobite armies, astonishingly dynamic, and so there was a difference. The other thing that means is, not only have we been through this process before, and from the government's perspective, pretty sick of it, but also some of these people that you're fighting against have previously been pardoned for their roles in 1715 and 1719, like Lord George Murray, for example, but he's only one of a good few. Some of them are the sons of men who had previously been exiled or executed, and so on. And there is a sense that this cannot go generation to generation. It has to be snuffed. But there's there is this sense that in the aftermath of the 15, there obviously were prosecutions. There is an arguable case, though, that in 1715 they came down harder on English Jacobites than they did on Scottish Jacobites, almost like we expect trouble from that lot, but not from this lot. And I'm pretty sure that contributes to why the bar for joining the Jacobites is so high in 1745 in England. But this time it is taken as a much more and the war has been drawn into the Highlands in a much more direct way than had been even in 15. 19, it never really gathers momentum. Although the key battle at Glenshiel is obviously in the Highlands, it's on a comparatively small scale, and it was a nipping in the bud exercise. Didn't result in a mass persecution through the Highlands. And there's another factor that's important to register as well, which is the sense that the Jacobites in 1745 had, with eyes open in a deliberate sense, had used Highland identity as a big part of their means of both intimidating the state and also as a way of trying to bind an identity together for its supporters. And so that feeds into the reasons why the government makes such efforts to suppress Highland aspects of Highland culture, Highland dress for men, and so on, because there is now a very clear association between Jacobitism and Highlanders, and that's always been there, but it is very, very overt by 1746, and that's all feeding into the way that they're perceiving the need to end it once and for all as an issue.
So we've talked about some of the consequences, but I'd like to kind of rewind a little bit to talk about the prince himself. You touched a little bit about his journey. He's got to get out of Scotland. Can you talk about that quest from the defeat to where he finally ends up?
Yeah, well, he's moving back now into the territory that he had first landed in back in July the previous year. So that's not to say it's a landscape that he knows by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly one that the people around him know extremely well. And it is Jacobite heartland territory here. So as he moves down the Great Glen, there is a belief that circulates around some Jacobite officers that there is supposed to be a rendezvous at Fort Augustus, which obviously, as we've heard previously, the Jacobites had taken. And that was to be a rendezvous in the event of a disaster. Obviously, Lord George Murray and others believed that the rendezvous was to be at Ruthven, another British outpost that the Jacobites had taken, and that's why they go there. What I suspect is being seen there is a fact that there must have been conversations about where they might have all wanted to meet up in the event of a problem, but that no decision had ever been made. Charles Edward reputedly himself said that one of his biggest regrets was not having a plan for what to do in the event of a defeat. So none of them knew exactly where to go. So Charles Edward is initially moving towards Fort Augustus in the hope that he'd be able to link up with people there. But he's moving there into Clandonald territory and towards Cameron territory, which means, of course, it's territory that the government is absolutely going to come down into as a top priority, because the government sees those as hostile, and so it's basically too hot for him to hang around these areas. Cameron of Lochiel has to sit on the hillside watching his house being burned down by the government, and as they come sweeping back down into that area, a considerable weight of Cumberland's forces move down the Great Glen to Fort Augustus and start fanning out from there, basically. So that is not a good area for Charles Edward to be lingering in. And as the patrols widen and as his options start to dwindle, he's driven really to the extremes of Scotland. He's driven out into the Hebrides off the west coast, because the mainland is just too hot. There is a huge concerted effort to find him and to take him. And as well of course as those other senior Jacobites, but obviously he's the principal target. One of the challenges that they have is that that side of Scotland has relatively few easy harbours that you can get rescue parties to. You've got very limited communications to get out to get anybody to even attempt them. So what you really need is support from the outside in order to help you get out. And that's going to take time. The other issue is that the Royal Navy has had a strong presence in these waters right since the beginning of the war, since the Jacobites, since the Prince managed to slip into that area. And of course, the siege, the Jacobite siege at Fort William, had drawn naval vessels up into those waters too to support the fort there. And so there's a heavy naval presence as well as a heavy military presence. Some Jacobite officers actually try to go the other way and head to the east coast, and then some characters like, for example, James Johnston, who we've not really talked about because he's a relatively junior player, but left a very lively and influential memoir of the conflict. He escaped by getting back to Edinburgh, and took a ship out of and eventually rowed out of Edinburgh and rowed to London, and then got a ship out of London to the continent, which is quite extraordinary. Talk about right under their noses. He just put a different coloured wig on, and off he went. I'm simplifying. He had a terrible time during all of that process, but it's indicative that some of them were trying to. Were taking extreme risks to try and get out by sea. As time passes, various networks are mobilised to try and support this. Obviously, the French are sending support to try and extract Jacobites from the Highlands, and also Swedish shipping plays a big part in getting people out. So Sweden's neutral, so their ships can come and go. There's a big Scottish community, for example, in Gothenburg and elsewhere in Sweden. So there's quite a network that is coordinating out of there. But all of that takes time, and basically your ability to find anybody is by chance. So Charles Edward, it takes him until September to get out of Scotland. So that's a considerable period of time in which the opportunity seems to diminish constantly. He is constantly on the move. It's that horrible scenario where the people that are going to help you are absolutely dependent on. But also by their act of helping you are exposing them to severe repercussions themselves. And often the people that are trying to help him are also wanted men themselves, and so it's about keeping moving, going to inaccessible places, often sleeping out in the open. Famously, various Jacobite leaders, including the Prince himself, make their homes in caves and ravines in the glens, where they're very difficult to find and see. where they can have a little bit of shelter for a few days. Unfortunately, the summer of 1745 is almost as ghastly as the winter of the summer of 1746 is almost as bad as the winter of 45 had been in terms of its weather. It's continually wet and uncomfortable right through that early summer. So there's not much reprieve. And so we end up with this, and it wasn't until really into the 20th century that people were able to start unpicking where Charles had been during all of this, and actually try and build a narrative of exactly what his roots were. And we end up with remarkable stories of sort of Charles Edward's rediscovery of himself, if I can put it. That's a very strange way of putting it, but he sort of the best characteristics that he has start to sort of re-emerge during this period. He is, at times, he's extremely maudlin and obviously and distressed at the situation. But for the most part, he's described as being upbeat and cheerful and extremely personable and grateful. So this is not a sort of guy who's out there expecting people to help him, or that's making demands, or expecting to be indulged. So there's a number of things that are worth drawing out there. Firstly, those inherent personality traits that we've seen flashes of right the way through the conflict, but that are often buried in all of the stress and the decision making. Now he's freed from all of that, in a sense, and he's dependent on others for the first time, really. The other thing is the physicality of what he's going through. It's immensely challenging. The landscapes that we're talking about here are not accommodating landscapes to be out on the run in. There's not a large and prosperous population up there to support him. Most of the people he's dealing with are living a subsistence lifestyle themselves. So it's another tranche of evidence for the physicality of Charles Edward, and the fact that he has gone through this whole campaign, marching in the boots with his men, as it were. And that's if he were the character that had been presented by Hanoverian propaganda and that still continues to circulate every now and again, then he simply wouldn't have survived those months upon the hills. Often with very little to eat. There are stories of him having to eat the grass in extremis, and so on. Now, his experience is not unique. That is one of the points to be made. There are other Jacobite leaders who are going through very similar things, but this is all the context, of course, that leads us to the most famous story of this part of the campaign, and possibly you might even argue the most famous bit of the whole story, full stop, when he ends up going over the sea to Skye, as the songsters put it. It is a remarkable story because you don't have to make it up. It is true that Flora MacDonald's father was working for the government. She wasn't a Jacobite in any meaningful, proactive way, except perhaps in sympathy. But she famously, when later challenged, said that she would have done the same for the Hanoverian Prince of Wales if he'd have been in the same situation. It was about helping a man in need, to Flora, she said. But what Flora essentially did for Charles, which was a huge risk, for which she did end up in the Tower of London for a while, was that she secured a pass because her father worked for the government. She secured a pass for her to be able to travel between some of the islands for her and her 6-foot-tall Irish blonde-haired, brown-eyed maid. Who was, of course, Charles Edward Stuart, and she stitched him a nice floral frock, gave him the name Betty Burke, and took the risk of masquerading that she was vouching for her as a servant. Charles Edward, it's a nice anecdote, so I like to share it, insisted on being armed, as I've said previously. And so when he was being dressed by Flora into his frock, he stuck pistols into his breeches underneath the skirts. And Flora chided him and said, obviously, that if he was searched, then they'd find the pistols and they'd know that it was him. And he said, but if they're searching under the skirts, then they might not need the pistols to know that it's not an Irish maid that they're dealing with here. So that's the sort of mindset. And there were reports later on in Charles's life that this bit of the story is the bit that he was prepared to talk about by the fireside over a dram when he was sitting in Rome in the twilight years. Whereas he didn't want to talk about much of the rest of it. So you can see why a story like that appeals. The crossing to Skye at the end of June 1746 was very treacherous, and the important thing to note is that the pursuit of Charles Edward was repeatedly extremely close, sometimes within sight, often within a couple of miles of his location. That's why he had to keep moving all of the time, because the danger was so acute and so close.
So Charles Edward is on the Isle of Skye. He eventually makes it to the continent. How does he actually end up, way up there to coming way down back to Europe?
Yeah, so eventually there's a parting whilst Charles is on the move at this period, before he meets Flora MacDonald, where John Sullivan leaves his side. Obviously, Sullivan's been a really important player in this whole story, and the two men have got a very strong bond by this point. And Sullivan leaves basically in order to try and get out and make the arrangements for making a proper rescue attempt, which can't be planned from inside the Highlands whilst you're on the run with him. So eventually, Charles is able to link up with a French vessel that is actively looking for him, and make his way back to the continent, and gets down to Roscoff, and immediately throws his clothes aside and says, "Right, okay, I'm off to Versailles. I'm sure they'll let me in this afternoon." Or whatever. So he very much still sees the mission as live by that point, but he's in a terrible state by the time that he gets out. As I say, he leaves Scotland on the 20th of September, 1746, departing from almost the exact same spot from where he first landed on the mainland. It's a part of the whole remarkable romance of this story is that it goes in such an amazing circle. He arrives with nothing and he leaves with nothing, essentially. And from the same spot, and he's physically dilapidated. It's fair to say by the rigors of what he's been going through. His feet and his legs are said to be in a particularly bad state. He's pockmarked with midgibites. He's got a gash in his cheek from trying to light his pipe with the flint of his pistol, and the wig that he has desperately clung onto during his period on the run is crawling with lice, and is the first thing he throws away as soon as he lands in France, only for two maids to fall out over who gets to keep it. He's not the glamorous Highland prince stepping onto the boat in his tartan finery as the Victorian prince would have us remember it. But the other thing that I will say is that he has during this time also been drinking pretty hard as well. during his course in the Highland. That is clearly part of a coping mechanism that doesn't leave him for the rest of his life. So he manages to escape. He's certainly not the first out. There are others who've got out before him. For example, the two brothers Drummond, the Duke of Perth and Lord John. They got out in May, considerably sooner than Charles Edward had. But unfortunately, the Duke of Perth dies at sea, quite possibly just exhausted from everything that's been happening for the last year. But John Drummond himself, now the new Duke of Perth, makes it back to the continent. Lord George Murray gets out as well. John Sullivan's out, and Lochiel eventually is out as well. So many of the senior Jacobite leaders do succeed in getting out. As I've already mentioned, the most senior ones or influential ones that don't are men like Tullibardine, and who wasn't very keen on the idea of going back into another long exile after he'd been in exile since 1715 already. But also John Murray of Broughton, who'd been the Prince's political secretary of state for the campaign. And Broughton had done a lot of the preparatory work for the rising, so he was captured, taken to Edinburgh, and then subsequently to London, where he doomed his reputation by turning King's evidence, and therefore saved his neck, but as I say, doomed his reputation thereafter, which is very unfortunate, not least because his contribution to the campaign had been very, very impressive, I think, all of which is ignored because he's become persona non grata in Jacobite circles.
So we talked about it a little bit about after this uprising, the Hanoverian kings, that they kind of cracked down much more than they had in the past. Can you kind of describe what policies they put in place to kind of keep this sort of situation from happening again?
Yeah, so there's a legal policy which is rooted in the Act of Prescription. So obviously, as they have attempted to do before, the Highlands are to be disarmed much more aggressively than had been done in 1750 and its aftermath, because it obviously hadn't worked. But attached to that also are famously the Dress Act, which it doesn't ban tartan, as it's often simplified, but it bans male Highland dress. So men, specifically men, are not allowed to walk around in tartan plaids and coats as they had been doing when marching under the Prince's banners. So that's the specific restriction there, and also the playing of pipes and so on. All measures designed to because bagpipes and tartan have now become associated with military Jacobitism. It's not a sort of I don't think it's rooted in a desire to eradicate a culture because of its culture. It's because of the association with military Jacobitism that they are being targeted. And that's obviously done through the Scottish courts. The Lord Preston Grange, who's the new Lord Advocate, lives on the edge of Prestonpans battlefield. And it's his responsibility to see it all through. But so that's one aspect of it. And then also, of course, there's the massive sort of military presence in Scotland that continues after the Rising's embers are stamped out. And now there's a lot of work that's been done by Murray Pittock on this that is due to come out pretty soon, I think. So I'm wary that anything I say might be immediately out of date once his book comes out. But there's there's maybe sort of 15,000 troops tied up in Scotland for the next 2 or 3 years at least. That's a massive amount of when you compare it to the sort of 3,500 that General General Cope had in Scotland in 1745. So this is, there is a visible difference in Scotland in the aftermath of the conflict. Soldiers are much more visible all over the country, and there is a much clearer perception that this is a state, a region that is being heavily sort of occupied. It's not a perception that Scotland had got before the Rising, and so it does. There is evidence that it does alienate people who had not fought for the Jacobites in the aftermath. Public opinion in Scotland initially is, amongst the pro-government Whiggish circles, is very pleased to hear of the defeat of the Jacobites, but as the months roll on, and the sight of people like the Duke of Perth's mother being dragged up to Edinburgh Castle and things, public opinion does start to turn, not towards the Jacobites, but against this sense that the target of these policies isn't the Jacobites anymore; it's Scotland, and that's a very important perception, and that is the perception that has outlasted the war, which is very significant. So I think it's really important to appreciate that change, but also just from a military perspective, the amount of soldiers that are now tied up in Scotland through 1746, 7, 8, who are therefore men who are not deployable elsewhere.
So, Aaron, we've been going through this as our 7th episode. For anyone who is interested in learning more, we already talked about a huge amount, but there's always more to learn and see. Would you recommend any resources or places to visit for people who want to dive into this a little bit more?
Oh yeah, well, there's huge amounts. The Jacobites have triggered so much interest over the generations, particularly interest in their material culture, which almost whilst it was all still happening was highly desirable and became very collectible. So there are some fabulous collections all over Scotland and beyond. If you were to want to get onto the ground, then you can trace most of these events very easily. You've got to start at Glenfinnan, of course, where we raised the standard back in August, where there's a substantial monument in a spectacularly beautiful location. The monument was raised in the early 19th century, as much to the local chief at the time as to his predecessor in 1745. But over the years has been mistaken for a statue of Charles Edward at the top, but it isn't. But that's the most famous starting point, and even if you're not into the Jacobites, you can see the Harry Potter train passing by. But you can follow the story through down not far from there, obviously at Fort William. Although there's only fragmentary traces of the fort itself still survive. There's an excellent museum in Fort William which has some very, very fine Jacobite artifacts in there. And then in Edinburgh itself, the National Museum of Scotland has, amongst other things, the Taj and the broadsword of Charles Edward that were taken in the baggage at Culloden, but also and rather more significantly, I think, in a way, the hanging side by side there are the regimental colours of Barrel's regiment and the Stuarts of Appin. That faced across the moor at Culloden in 46. There's, if you're into portraiture, there's an absolutely incredible gallery in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, entirely devoted to the Jacobite conflicts, which include the only portrait known to have been done of Charles Edward whilst he was in Scotland. From life, which was recently rediscovered. So there are always new things being found. And obviously, I have to say that you must visit the battlefield at Prestonpans and my little museum there. But of course, most people gravitate to the end of the story, which is a bugbear of mine I've had for many years, that we all read this story from the end. Because we know it's a defeat, we assume it's always bound to be a defeat. But Culloden is an unmissable location to visit. A very high quality museum and exhibition space, but also an extremely evocative battlefield space too. What I will stress, though, because I stress it every opportunity I have, is that the portion of battlefield that is accessible, that is owned by the National Trust for Scotland, is only about a fifth of the battlefield. There is a much, much bigger area. None of the locations which Charles Edward stood on at Culloden are within the area owned by the National Trust for Scotland, for example. So in our minds, we reduce it into the one area of the Highland charge crashing into Barrel's regiment and the mass graves around it. But it is much bigger than that. So there's always work to be done to make sure those landscapes are preserved. But there's a huge amount of locations, smaller locations, and clan museums and hidden nuggets. One of my favourite artefacts relating to the 45 is Johnny Cope's travelling fiddle, which was left behind by him at Prestonpans. I can see why it wasn't his first priority to grab it as things were disintegrating, but it was part of the baggage that was given to Robertson of Struan as his reward for bringing his men out to the 45, having done so at every previous Jacobite rising before. And Prince Charlie took pity on him and said, "Look, for goodness sake, you're too old to be fighting and marching. Leave your men here, obviously, but you can go home." And sent him back. And the only way to persuade him was to give him all of Cope's private baggage as his reward. And so in the very small clan museum for the Robertsons, the Clandonachie Museum up at Brewer, there is Johnny Cope's travelling fiddle on display in the Scottish Highlands, I just think it's a magic little thing to have survived. So all of that is there. There's a vast amount of literature for you to dive into as well, huge amounts, and new stuff being produced all of the time. Often with different folky, and as I say, so from our friend Chris Duffy's some massive 45 later revised in Fight for a Throne, through to dozens and dozens of biographies of Bonnie Prince Charlie, some of which are better than others.
And so, Aaron, if I could just bring us back to Chris for a second. Passion project in the last 10 years of his life. Of course, he passed in 22, or 23, was it? Development on the battlefield at Culloden. Is that still a conversation that's happening? Is there any possibility that the National Trust for Scotland might acquire more of the battlefield? I mean, can you update us on that at all?
Well, I can't really, in the sense that I think things are relatively quiet at the moment, but the conversation hasn't gone away. The problem hasn't gone away, certainly. That's one of the reasons why I take every opportunity to make that point about how little of the battlefield is protected. Time and again, it's been demonstrated to my satisfaction that the only way to protect a battlefield is to own it, and so hopefully part of Christopher's legacy one day will be that the National Trust for Scotland is in a stronger position to buy more of that land up and take it into ownership. Certainly, the National Trust for Scotland takes it seriously as a conversation, but inevitably what happens, and I see this at battlefields all over the place, and I'm sure it's the same outside of Scotland too, is that there's a lot of conversation around it when there's an immediate live threat. And then when there isn't, everybody goes quiet again. But it's in the quiet times when you have the space to solve the problem. And so we have to get away from waiting for there to be an immediate problem, because by the time a problem hits the planning stage, it's almost too late for you to really mobilise and stop it effectively. But yeah, it's not a problem unique to Culloden. but Culloden is far and away the most emotive battlefield in Scottish memory. And so there is a strong argument that I have made before that says, look, if Culloden battlefield isn't safe, then no battlefield is safe, and so we have to make that case. But also, our understanding of the battlefield is changing all of the time. A lot of press coverage in recent weeks about archaeological finds at Culloden. Big intact mortar bomb that was found recently, still with its plug-in, which was quite amazing to see the other week. But also there have been reassessments presented by Historic Environment Scotland as to exactly where the Culloden Park walls boundaries were. And if they're right, then it skews the battle lines in our understanding. Not entirely sure that they are 100% right, and I don't think Chris was. But he was promising me a write-up on his views on that. Sadly, just before he passed, so we don't know. But my point is, our understanding of the battlefields at Culloden, at Prestonpans, at Falkirk, they are still evolving. We're still learning new things, new documents still cropping up, new interpretations still coming out. And so there's always new material. We've still not finished.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron, for sticking with us for this entire series. This has been absolutely amazing, and I think, like we said in the past, I think we're going to be a little lost when we don't have our Jacobite episode every few weeks. But like you said, there's a 15, and there's more material out there. So hopefully we can do more Jacobites at another point. Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.